yourself sitting in a restaurant around 55 years ago. The section you are sitting in is made up of only one race. If you were Caucasian, you'd be sitting on the nice side of the restaurant. But if you were an African American, you'd be sitting on the rundown second-class section of the restaurant. The service you would receive would be unfathomable given the service that we are used to receiving today. This is what many people suffered from less than half a century ago. A couple of weeks ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. I Have a Dream were the most famous words spoken by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1963 speech on the suffering of African Americans due to the color of their skin. Today we will discuss the three main impacts of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech on the civil rights movement. We'll talk about how it brought more attention to the civil rights movement, how it hastened the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and how it encouraged the passage of anti-voting discrimination laws. Most of the information I will give you today comes from the History Channel website, the Senate Judiciary Committee website, the Department of Justice website, Smithsonian Institute History Wired website, and King's Online Encyclopedia. The first impact of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech was that it brought greater attention and racial cooperation to the civil rights movement. According to the History Channel website, more than 200,000 people attended his speech during the March on Washington. The people who attended were of all different races. In his speech, Dr. King encouraged people of different races to work together. He said, "Many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom." He also promoted the practice of nonviolence by saying, "We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence." His message of nonviolence was in contrast to the messages of other civil rights leaders at the time. Not only did Dr. King's speech have a social impact, it also had a political impact which helped with the passage of anti-discrimination laws. The second impact of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech was that it hastened the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When the March on Washington was held, people were fed up with the inactivity of the government towards civil rights. The purpose of the March on Washington was to advocate for the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which included many of the things Dr. King talked about in his speech. After his speech, Dr. King and other leaders met with the President and Vice President at the White House to discuss the passing of the Civil Rights Act. A few months later, in July of 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. This act provided for the desegregation of public places, prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, gender, and nationality. The passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 laid the groundwork for future voting rights acts. The third impact of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech was that it helped encourage the passing of anti-voting discrimination laws. In January of 1964, less than 5 months after Dr. King's speech, the 24th Amendment was ratified. The 24th Amendment outlawed poll tax, which was money people had to pay in order to vote. This was only part of the change to voting laws. In March of 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. It had two key provisions. It outlawed literacy tests, which were reading tests people had to pass in order to vote, and it required any changes that affected voting in certain districts to be approved by the Attorney General or the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia. By passing these anti-voting discrimination laws, African Americans and other minorities were allowed to vote. The discriminatory laws were removed, and African Americans were finally free again, and most were able to vote for the first time. As you can see, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech has had a major impact on the civil rights movement, especially in the areas of gaining attention for the movement, expediting the Civil Rights Act, and encouraging the passing of anti-voting discrimination laws. Martin Luther King Jr. and his I Have a Dream speech have made a tremendous impact on people all over the world, and not just in the area of civil rights. Many cities even have streets named after him. Taking you back to the 50th anniversary that happened just a few weeks ago, with all the festivities, speakers, and commemorative walks, you can see what a difference a man with a dream can make on the world.